The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Let's see now. First off, as Joseph Goebbels said in introducing Adolf Hitler at the Sports Palace in 1932, "You will silence your cell phones." I was speaking, last week or so at the FDR library down in Hyde Park, and I'd forgotten all my notes. I'd left them on the kitchen counter, and at the end of the day, they said, don't ever bring your notes again. Or maybe they said, don't ever come again. I'm not sure. But we're gonna try and do it without notes because it's more exciting, at least for me, in doing this. And so I had done 3 studies of presidential politics before. 1920, 1948, 1960. So we were on that path, and you do something and you say, well, we can do that again, but you kind of have to do it with a twist after a while. And we had done juxtapositions of people, JFK versus Nixon, and all the people involved in 1920, the year of the 6 presidents. But this 1932, of course, involved this amazing juxtaposition of jumping across the Atlantic Ocean to see what was going on at the same time. And we see the parallels between the careers of 2 guys who are really very dissimilar, Adolf Hitler and Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1932 is the year in which both face presidential elections. They take power in early 1933, but they die within a couple weeks of each other in 1945. There's that little thing called World War II in between. So there are the dates. They ascend to power. They perish at about the same time. One of the interesting things is the subtitle of the book, 2 Tales of Politics, Betrayal, and Unlikely Destiny. And it's really Unlikely Destiny, which is very, very interesting. Hitler is, of course, really unlikely. Aside from matters of public policy, there's his background in which he's, living in basically a homeless shelter in Vienna, a high school dropout, a fellow who ends World War I essentially in a psychiatric wing of a military hospital. In 1923, he tries to overthrow the government. He could have been executed for that. From 1925 on, he renounces his citizenship. He's a stateless person. He doesn't become a German citizen until the middle part of 1932. He can't even vote in that election or in any German election until that point, let alone run for president. But then that is bestowed upon him as he gains a small appointment from one of the German provinces. That's how citizenship can be obtained, and so he runs. Franklin Roosevelt is unlikely in a far different way. He enjoys all the advantages that Adolf Hitler does not. He comes from this baronial sort of family in the Hudson Valley, this wonderful mansion with, ice yachts on the Hudson, a loving relationship with both of his parents, goes to the finest schools and all that. But people regard him as a lightweight. Bernard Baruch calls him an amiable Boy Scout. Walter Lippmann, the great syndicated columnist and opinion molder at the early part of the century, the mid part of the century, says this is a guy with no particular qualifications to be president and no particular reason to be. So people are not sure where he stands on the issues. People are not sure if he's honest enough, that political thing of, you know, because politics is often not telling people where you're going, and maybe not even knowing where you're going, where you want to go yourself, except that you want the office, that you want to ascend politically. And there is that little matter of polio, where you know, we may say right now that Charles Krauthammer is a brilliant man, but we do not see him running for office. Certainly back then, the issue of whether Franklin Roosevelt would be strong enough physically and mentally to be president, an issue which he hoped to avoid. Sometimes he would use it to his advantage, and people who met him just marveled at his strength of character in overcoming polio. But basically, let's face it, he tried to keep this hidden from the American people. And he would write to people. He would write to people and politicians, well, you know, I'll be ready in a couple years to just walk with a cane. It's just a little infirmity I have. I don't use a wheelchair, just a little kitchen chair, which is actually technically true, but of course the grand picture is false. He's paralyzed, and he's going to remain paralyzed. And it's a question of, I think, not only of him deceiving other people, but I think maybe for a long part of that also deceiving himself. And I don't criticize that at all, because I think it gives him the strength to go on, and in many cases, false hope is better than real despair. So he overcomes that. He is an unlikely person to rise to the office of President of the United States. There's other parallels involving years as well. 1928, Franklin Roosevelt just squeaks into the governorship of the state of New York, just by a little bit. They have to count those votes, and Al Smith, who's the governor and who's Franklin Roosevelt's mentor at that point, he is saying, you know, we're going to investigate those upstate precincts unless those votes are counted. And so FDR comes in by a very hairbreadth margin. In 1928, Hitler's Nazi Party has about 12 seats in the Reichstag. There are a lot of seats in the Reichstag. 12 is a lot. 1930, everything changes for both men, because what's intervened between 1928 and 1930 is 1929 and the Great Depression. 1930 for Franklin Roosevelt, he wins re-election by the biggest margin ever accorded to a New York State governor. And the next day, people like Will Rogers says, the Democratic Party has chosen its nominee for 1932, and it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Big state, 45 electoral votes. The real empire state at that time, everything that California is now, only probably more so. 1932, Adolf Hitler's party goes from 12 seats in the Reichstag to 107. From a party which is going nowhere fast at the ballot box to the second biggest party in the Reichstag. He's on the move. So they are unlikely in many ways. Getting back to where they stand, or where Franklin Roosevelt stands on the issues, he is not, one of the big issues still at this point, even with the Depression gaining steam, is prohibition. It's amazing how much of the debate at both the Democratic Party's National Convention in '32 and the Republicans is devoted to prohibition. It's really mind-boggling to think of what they're talking about in that compared to the Great Depression, but they are. And Franklin Roosevelt has been pretty evasive on the topic. He's wobbled all over the lot. Some people have said that he was the driest of the major candidates running in '32. That is the most in favor of prohibition. He had generally been for like local option and stuff like that. He doesn't come out for repeal until a speech in Buffalo in early 1932. So he's very late to the game on that. He's also treading water very carefully with this thing called Tammany Hall in New York City and Mayor James J. Walker, who is a major league crook. And the administration is really starting to smell with one investigation after another into corruption in New York City. And Roosevelt needs I think it's 96 delegates from New York, largely controlled by Tammany, at the convention, but he also needs to look to the rest of the country like he's not in league with them. He had started out in opposition to Tammany, and after he gets his head handed to him in the 1914 primary for United States Senate, he gets clobbered. He realizes you cannot fight Tammany Hall, and he doesn't after that point. So what's he going to do about Walker? For a long time, it's not too much, not anything more than he absolutely has to. Another issue where you're not sure where he stands is the League of Nations. Big issue in 1920. He had been a part of Woodrow Wilson's administration, a Wilsonian, a supporter of the League. And on New Year's Day or the day after, in a radio station from Los Angeles, a gentleman named William Randolph Hearst gives a speech blasting just about everybody. Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, Al Smith. And one of the things he really hates about the politicians of that day, and of course Hearst is a powerful man, not just because he's speaking on that radio station, but because he controls so many major metropolitan newspapers. Three alone in New York City at that point. Huge amount of the circulation in California. Magazines, a movie studio. And what's Franklin Roosevelt going to do about Hearst? He doesn't like Hearst. Most people don't like Hearst, but you ignore him at your peril. Roosevelt's advisor, Louis McHenry Howe, says you better do something about it. And so Franklin Roosevelt chooses to deliver a speech in late January at a very prestigious venue, the Albany County Grange, in which he walks away from the idea of the League of Nations. Oh, it was a fine idea, but it's no longer relevant to our times and will not be an issue in this campaign. See you, Woodrow. And really, for most of the decade, he's no longer the internationalist of the Wilson era. It's only until war becomes really breathing down our necks in Europe in 38, 39, that he becomes interested in international affairs. Again, Hitler is also wobbling all about. He has an alliance of very disparate elements in Germany. It's national and it's socialist. So you get these extreme nationalists, people who had, probably been very enthusiastic for the Kaiser at one point, versus people who are extremely left-wing. We tend to think of National Socialism as a right-wing movement, but that socialist part of its name has some meaning, and you see key guys like Gregor Strasser and particularly Joseph Goebbels, who are really left-wing guys. Goebbels devotes some space in his diaries to complaining about how we're too anti-communist and maybe we should be on their side. And at one point he describes himself as a national Bolshevik. So we have those things going on within the Nazi Party. In 1932, we all know that there's going to be an election every 4 years in America. There's going to be an election every 7 years in Weimar Germany. And the incumbent president is a fellow named Paul Hindenburg. He had been a hero in World War I, field marshal, a right-wing monarchist, anti-democratic, authoritarian sort of guy. But at this point, he's sort of the glue holding the Weimar Republic, or what's left of it, together. And in 1925, when he runs, he's run by the nationalists. But he hasn't been nationalist enough. But it appears he's the only guy who can stop Hitler in 1932. So the people who were opposed to him in 25, the socialists and the Catholics, who have their own political party, actually a couple of them, back him. So everyone changes partner and dances at that point. He's 84 years old and not doing particularly well, but he's going to run again, basically to stop Hitler. There's not much left holding this country together, and there are, we'll go a little bit ahead to the 1932 Reichstag elections. 13 parties win seats in the Reichstag that year. 51 parties obtain votes. Okay, we complain about the American two-party system, and there's certainly enough reason for it, where no Republican is satisfied with where the Republican Party is going, no Democrat is fully satisfied with where the Democratic Party is going. Well, we make compromises, and we get along. Nobody's compromising with anybody in Weimar Germany. The socialists hate the communists hate everybody, the Nazis hate everyone. The nationalists, who should be fairly close to Hitler, are often at dagger points with them. The middle class parties are basically evaporating after the crash. You see elements within the Catholic parties not cooperating with each other. Everyone's everyone's betrayed somebody, and it's almost impossible to form a parliamentary government at that point. But back to that presidential election. Hitler was not necessarily going to be their candidate. Why? Again, because he was not even a citizen. But he does run. There's some thought maybe they'll run some of the more low-key Nazis in his place. But he runs, and he thinks he's going to win. Himmler is alerting the SS guys, like, don't get drunk at the victory celebration in Berlin, okay? But he doesn't come close. Hindenburg, in a four-man race, just misses the outright majority that he needs. And people are relishing the thought that Hitler is going to have to run again if he dares and get crushed this time. Because everyone's going to, at this point, vote for Hindenburg, and Hitler's just finally going to get embarrassed again. Hitler immediately says, I'm going to run. I'm going to run again, and we're going to take this election to the people. He can't go on the radio. Franklin Roosevelt is known as a great radio orator. In 1932, it's a state-owned broadcasting system in Germany, and they're smart enough to keep the Nazis off for a very long time. And the first two guys who go on the radio for them are Gregor Strasser and Paul Joseph Goebbels, not Hitler. He's off the radio. He's got to reach people. He's obviously this guy who can reach them at mass rallies, but he's only got a couple weeks to work in this campaign, and how's he going to get around to all of Germany in those 2 weeks? And he's going to do it in a way which projects the fact that he's a forward-thinking guy, the wave of the future, not like this Hindenburg guy, not like these 13 or 51 parties, but the guy who's the future. And he does that by getting on an airplane. This is only 5 years after Lindbergh, and his campaign is going to be on a plane. His slogan, Hitler over Germany, has two meanings. One, physically over Germany, flying over Germany, and also over Germany, ruling over Germany eventually. This really is very successful for him, and he increases his votes by a lot. He takes votes from the communists, and he takes votes from the extreme nationalists. And it looks like the Nazi tide is going to be unstoppable. Where will we hold this great onrushing rush of the brown shirts? Back to America. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked like he had the collection or the election locked up for a few months. His competition, very weak. A bunch of favorite Sun guys. Albert Ritchie of Maryland, very Jeffersonian sort of Democrat, although he's a handsome guy, popular in his own way, an extreme wet. He's for repeal of prohibition, so he's on the right side of that issue as the public opinion is turning. But he tells H.L. Mencken, you know, I could give more speeches to get my campaign rolling, but I don't have any more ideas. So he has no ideas. There's a guy named Alfalfa Bill Murray, who's the governor of Oklahoma, who's a complete wild man. He almost gets in a border war with Texas over bridge tolls. I mean, he's declared martial law, and besides, you can't take a guy named Alfalfa Moore, Bill, you know, seriously, not happening. But there are a couple guys who are going to appear. The one guy that William Randolph Hearst mentions favorably in that radio talk is a guy named John Nance Garner. He's Speaker of the House. And he's never given a thought in his life to running for president. But if William Randolph Hearst says, this is the one guy who could be president, you go, fine. Okay, we'll give it a tumble. We'll give it a tumble, and we'll see what happens there. Also, Alfred Emanuel Smith, former governor of New York, FDR's mentor. When FDR takes office, Al Smith thinks he's going to be still calling the shots. He's going to be the man behind the throne, the man behind the wheelchair. He says, don't worry, go to Warm Springs, get healthy, your Lieutenant Governor Herbert Lehman can take care of things for you, and we'll meet, and I'll give you a hand on running this state. He's even going to take a room at the DeWitt Clinton, so he can be right on hand to the executive mansion. FDR wants no part of this. He's going to be his own man. Al Smith soon checks out of that room at the DeWitt Clinton, but before that has happened, FDR has canned two people that Smith really wants FDR to keep on. One is Belle Moskowitz, a very pioneering woman in government, very capable woman. She was Secretary of the Governor. FDR cans her, and he canned someone else who was Secretary of State, who was very highly thought of by Smith, and that person is none other than Robert Moses. Okay. Smith's frustration grows and grows and grows, and by early 1932, he runs for president again. Realistically, probably not to win, but to stop Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt gets off to a good start in the conventions, in the back rooms, and a few primaries. But then he runs into the Massachusetts primary. He's won a couple of the northern New England primaries, and that emboldens him, even though he's warned, don't go into Massachusetts. There are too many Irish Catholic Democrats in Massachusetts who are in love with Al Smith. You're asking for trouble. But FDR's head has gotten a little too big, and he gets that head handed to him. Smith crushes him in Massachusetts. And then, once the bleeding starts, the bleeding increases. Smith wins conventions in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Connecticut. Roosevelt underperforms in Pennsylvania. Garner takes the delegates in Texas, and then we move on to California. In California, there's always a California primary at the end of this thing. Hearst has all the newspapers out there, and somebody issues a flyer for the primary, and it says, if you're dry, vote for Garner. If you're wet, vote for Smith. If you don't know where you stand, vote for Roosevelt. Well, I guess people knew where they stood, and Roosevelt finishes second. Garner gets all the delegates in California. So going into the convention, Roosevelt is in trouble. He's also in trouble for another reason. He arrives at the convention with a majority of delegates. Yeah. So why is he in trouble? Because the Democrats have something called the 2/3 rule. And you have to get 2/3 of the delegates. It's always been something to keep the South in line. Or not in line, but to keep them on board so that they don't feel isolated in the Democratic Party. And he hasn't got 2/3. 1 ballot, 2 ballots, 3 ballots, 4 ballots. It looks like if he doesn't get it soon, if he doesn't get on the next ballot, and his campaign manager, Jim Farley, goes to the California delegates and says, if we don't get it soon, it's going to go to someone you like even less. So he's warning them. There's also a thing called the unit rule, which means that if you've got all the votes in Mississippi voting for you on the floor, there might be 5 Roosevelt guys and 4 for somebody else. So if 2 guys switch, you're going to lose Mississippi. The same thing could happen in Arkansas and a couple other states. And if those things start happening, then the wheels really fall off Roosevelt, and it could come out to a dark horse candidate, who could be a fellow like Owen D. Young from out in Herkimer County originally, who's head of GE, or like Newton D. Baker, Secretary of War under Woodrow Wilson. That's the guy that Herbert Hoover really fears as the candidate. And a lot of the intellectual guys like Lippmann, they think this is the guy who could be the best Democratic president. But William Randolph Hearst, of all the people he hates, he may hate Newton D. Baker the most of all. And he keeps getting calls from a guy named Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy and Hearst have a few things in common. They're wealthy. They're Democrats. Although Joe Kennedy, his Democratic credentials are really pretty poor at this point. In 1924, he supports the Progressive Party ticket. He even loans his Rolls Royce to the vice presidential candidate of the Progressives. Sort of a mixed message there. And in 1928, he's got to be the only Irish Catholic in the country who's supporting Al Smith. But by the time the Depression comes, he wants to support Franklin Roosevelt. He's scared the economic system may collapse, and in his estimation, supporting Roosevelt is the best way to prop things up and probably to further his own ambitions as well. So he keeps calling William Randolph Hearst and says, if it isn't Roosevelt, it's going to be Baker. And Hearst goes, can it be Albert Ritchie? No. It's too late for him. It's not going to happen. You can name the ticket, you can name Roosevelt, and then you can name Garner as vice president. And that's exactly what happened. There's another tradition long gone from presidential conventions, which we see changing that year, which is candidates used to be notified several weeks afterwards that they were nominated. There would be a ceremony, say in Hyde Park or Northampton, Massachusetts, if you were Calvin Coolidge, that you were nominated and you gave your acceptance speech, not at the convention, but in your hometown. And this would assume to be the case in 1932, except assumptions are not always wise. And like Adolf Hitler, Franklin D. Roosevelt gets in an airplane, flies to the convention, delivers his acceptance speech, and electrifies the nation. And this does a couple of things. It's, again, I'm going to break with traditions. I'm going to make sure that what has bound us previously and bound us in getting out of this depression no longer holds, and that I'm the forward-thinking guy, and also a sort of hidden message of mobility as well. Mobility. I can run this campaign, and I can do it in new ways. But again, it's still a scary thing to fly. He does okay flying. One of his sons gets airsick on the plane. But how primitive it still is. It took him 7 hours to fly from Albany to Chicago. It required 2 stops. He had to stop in Buffalo and Cleveland. Nonetheless, the campaigns are, on the way to happening that year. And Roosevelt is not going to have any great amount of troubles with Hoover, and he's aided by the very sad incident in Washington, where the bonus marchers come in. They want an advance on this bonus payment they have been promised from Congress. Congress adjourns without voting it, and these thousands of guys stick around, and the question is, what are you going to do about it? They are squatting in public buildings which are going to be torn down. New public buildings are going to be built, creating jobs for people in a depression, and they won't leave. They attacked the police force. They attacked the actual chief of police in Washington that year. 2 bonus marchers are shot dead in that incident, and that is when Herbert Hoover calls out General Douglas MacArthur and a young officer named George Patton to clear the streets of Washington and to clear this camp. And so we get the images of their shacks being burned out, of American troops in gas masks with bayonets fixed marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in rush hour to preserve order. Nobody is killed in the MacArthur expedition, shall we call it, but the optics are terrible. The first couple days of press for Hoover are okay, but then it sinks in, and this really sinks his chances completely for re-election. In Germany, there are elections going off all year. There's those 2 presidential elections, and then they are followed by 2 Reichstag elections. In the first one in July, wow, from 107 seats, the Nazis moved to 230. They are now the biggest party in Germany. Hermann Göring is president of the Reichstag. And what's going to happen is even more chaos. Even more chaos. Before this, the Nazis could say, we're not part of the government, we have no responsibility for it, but now they are. And the chaos continues in Berlin. One observer from France takes a look at Hermann Göring on the podium of the Reichstag and uses a phrase I love. He says, he's half clown, half executioner. And that's about right. The Nazis are about ready to blow apart. A lot of them want Hitler to make some sort of a deal to let them into government, to give them the offices, the power, whatever, even a small part of it. And then there are the guys who just want a revolution in the streets, these stormtroopers, continuing the violence, fighting against the police, fighting against the communists in the streets of Berlin or all through Germany. And the violence increases as the year goes on. There's a particularly gruesome incident where a Polish coal miner, his home is invaded in Silesia by stormtroopers. He is beaten to death with pool cues and clubs and stabbed to death in front of his own mother. 5 of them are convicted and sentenced to death very quickly by the government. And Hitler issues a statement, I will not turn my back on these fighters for freedom. And the mask sort of falls off the Nazis. People go, oh, maybe they aren't the people to bring us together. Maybe they aren't the people to lead us out of this mess. Parliament dissolves again. There's an election in November, and the Nazis lose 2 million votes. People think that Hitler has, to use a phrase later used about him, missed the bus. But in fact, because people can't agree on what's going to happen in Germany, there's almost no one else left to turn to. It's supposed to be the most democratic constitution in the world, what Weimar has, but there's a couple provisions in it which are anti-democratic, which short-circuit the working of a parliamentary democracy. Article 48 and Article 25. Article 48 says the president can issue laws, promulgate laws on his own. The president, not the chancellor, the president, Hindenburg. I mean, it can be overridden by the Reichstag if they get enough votes. Okay. This is like executive orders, as we're hearing a lot about now. And this can be dangerous because this is the ultimate basis of how things shake down in Germany. And it's happening even before Hitler. But it can be overruled by the Reichstag, except for Article 25. Article 25 says the president can dissolve the Reichstag at any given moment for no reason at all, at will, at whim. So if the parliament, if the Reichstag says we're going to overrule the president, he can say, feeling lucky, punk? Because I'll dissolve you and you'll have to run again. And what makes you think? What makes you think you can hold on to your job? What makes you think you can hold on to your salary, your free railroad pass, all the perks of power? And what makes you think that the Nazis won't rise up again and things will get even worse? Or the communists rise up again because they're starting to rise up again and people are getting more nervous because the communist vote is also rising. So maybe you should turn to the Nazis, okay? And there has been that part which we haven't talked about of the subtitle, which is betrayal. The politicians at the heart of the German government have been betraying each other all year. There's a guy named Kurt von Schleicher. Schleicher means schemer in Germany, of all things, and he's the master schemer. He installs and then uninstalls one chancellor after another until he is chancellor. And then the guy he has made and then broke, a guy named Franz von Papen, who in the meantime has become great friends with Paul von Hindenburg, determines he's going to have his revenge. And his revenge is going to involve putting Adolf Hitler in as Chancellor of Germany. Dangerous move, perhaps. Von Papen is not at this point, and actually never is a member of the Nazi Party. But he's going to put Hitler in, but he's going to box him in. This is the plan. Hitler will be Chancellor, a new office will be created, Vice Chancellor, held by Franz von Papen. Of the 8 cabinet posts, the Nazis will get only two, and unimportant ones. One is without portfolio, the Hermann Goering. So they will not get a lot. This will be almost like a coalition government, and beyond that, remember, all the power is still held by the president, by Hindenburg. He's the guy who issues those decrees. He's the guy who dissolves parliament, not Hitler, not the chancellor. Hitler can only go in and talk to Hindenburg in von Papen's presence. So von Papen says, we have hired Hitler. He's going to work for us, not the reverse. On paper, it makes sense. In reality, we know the ending. Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933 in January. Part of this is through, people think, the blackmail of Oscar von Hindenburg, Paul von Hindenburg's son, regarding some land transfers. So it all comes together there. Roosevelt's not going to take power until March 1933. The banking crisis becomes worse and worse. And in America, dictatorship is in the air. One of the people working with MacArthur and Patton in that bonus march clearing out was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower. Not exactly a radical guy. The epitome of moderation in American politics. And he says to his diary, people call me Dictator Ike, because I think that's what's needed in this country. There's a film called Gabriel Over the White House, produced by Hearst, which talks about a president essentially becoming a dictator. Roosevelt punches up that script and shows the movie to Congress 3 times. There's another movie put out by another studio called Mussolini Speaks for $100,000, narrated by Lowell Thomas, which is essentially a commercial, a infomercial for Benito Mussolini. It makes $1 million in a year when the studios are going broke. Smith and Lippmann, guys who had opposed Roosevelt, are talking publicly about how Roosevelt should assume dictatorial powers. To his credit, he does not. He's a different guy than Hitler. America is a different guy than Germany. We close the book by talking about a parade in Germany witnessed by a journalist named Dorothy Thompson, who had interviewed Hitler in 1932 and thought, little man, I thought I was going to see the next leader of Germany, but you'll never get it. By now, she's wised up, and she sees these columns of armed stormtroopers and Wehrmacht guys coming at her with torches ablaze and drums beating, searchlights cutting across the sky, and she says, post-war Germany is over. Pre-war Germany has begun. and so had America at that time. Thank you.